Sleepy Winks presents The Tortoise and the Hare, adapted by Zach Connor, performed for you by Zach and Heather Connor. Our story begins in the rolling hills of the Great Smoky Mountains. Tucked into the forest lives an abundance of creatures. But today, we're turning our attention to the tortoise,
Why, hello.
and the hare.
How do you do?
The tortoise has always taken life at his own pace,
What's the rush?
he would say to all of his forest friends. The hare, on the other hand, was determined to get a week's worth of work done in a single day.
No time to waste.
He would yell to everyone as he ran from place to place. One particularly misty day, the tortoise had decided to clean his home. He knew, before he got started, that he needed some fresh water to help him clean, so he grabbed his bucket and made his way outside into the cool morning air. On the same day, the hare had a lot of chores to do also. He ran from tree to tree and around his burrow, making sure everything was spick and span. He swept and washed, trimmed and polished. He even dusted his furniture with his fluffy bunny tail. Halfway through the day, Hare realized he was out of water to keep cleaning. He grabbed his bucket and sprinted out of his door. When the hare arrived at the river, he noticed a long line of creatures waiting to fill their buckets with water. Patience was something the hare did not have a lot of. He tapped the raccoon in front of him and said,
Excuse me, Mrs. Raccoon, but what could possibly be taking so long?
Oh, dear me,
said Mrs. Raccoon.
I didn't even notice you were behind me. It seems the tortoise is at the front of the line filling his bucket, and, as you know, the tortoise is not the fastest of us woodland creatures.
The hare tapped his foot, crossed his arms, and heaved a heavy sigh of frustration. He was not used to having to wait for things. He grabbed his bucket and sprinted to the front of the line. Once he arrived, he saw the tortoise just about to dip his bucket into the river. The hare cleared his throat and said,
Excuse me, good fellow, but why do you insist on moving so slow?
The tortoise slowly turned to the hare with a smile and replied,
I'm not so very slow. I just don't see why we have to hurry.
Not slow? You not slow?
The hare laughed.
You are so slow that I could beat you at anything. Just name it.
The tortoise thought for a moment and said,
All right then. How about a race?
Hearing this, the hare could hardly contain himself.
A race?
He gasped through laughs.
You versus me? Oh, you silly fellow. You don't stand a chance.
The tortoise replied,
Very well. We will race in 2 days.
With one last chuckle, the hare scooped up some water with his bucket and darted away so fast the tortoise only caught a glimpse of brown fur as the hare streaked away. The next day, the forest was buzzing with talk of the upcoming race. The tortoise spent the day stretching and practicing his running form. The tortoise's neighbor, the chipmunk, looked down at the tortoise and couldn't help but chuckle, because she thought the same way the hare did, that the tortoise was very slow.
I don't know why you even bother.
She yelled down from her home in the tree above tortoises.
There is absolutely no way you will ever beat the hare in a race. He is simply too fast.
The tortoise, finishing his stretching, slowly turned his head up to her, smiled, and replied,
Sometimes speed isn't everything.
The chipmunk chuckled to herself again and said,
Well, dear, in a race, it is.
The tortoise just nodded and continued working on his form. The hare spent the day lounging around his home. He was so confident about the race the next day, he spent no time stretching or preparing for it at all. High up in the old tree above the hare's burrow lived a wise old owl. He saw the hare napping in the sun and called down to him,
Who do you think will win the race tomorrow?
The hare opened one eye to look up at him and replied back,
I would imagine it would be whoever is faster. Wouldn't you agree, Owl?
The owl, tending to agree with the tortoise that speed is not everything, shook his head and ruffled his feathers.
Not necessarily,
He replied back.
Sometimes it is not about how fast you can run, but about who you are on the inside.
The hare closed his eye again and muttered,
Well, Owl, in a race, speed does matter.
and went back to napping. The next morning, all of the woodland creatures were up early and making their way to the race course. There were birds and squirrels, deer and raccoons, chipmunks, skunks, foxes, and even the grumpy old badger came out of his den to watch the race. The hare was already at the starting line, leaning confidently against a tree and eating an apple. Eventually, the tortoise made his way slowly up to the starting line. The hare gobbled up the rest of his apple, core and all, and appeared next to the tortoise in the blink of an eye.
Good morning, Tortoise.
He exclaimed, getting ready to take off down the course.
And a good morning to you, my friend.
Replied the tortoise happily.
It is an exceptionally beautiful day today, isn't it?
Asked the hare.
Indeed, it is,
Said the tortoise, enjoying a deep breath of fresh morning air.
Well, at least you can enjoy the nice weather when you lose today.
The hare said to the tortoise as he crouched down into a running position.
You know, that is very true.
Replied the tortoise. Both the tortoise and the hare were now ready to take off down the dirt path that wound its way through the forest. A squirrel made its way up the trunk of an old hollow tree with a nut, held it over its head, and yelled down,
On your mark, get set.
A hush now came over the forest as all the creatures held their breath for the start of the race.
Go!
Yelled the squirrel as he banged a nut against the tree stump, causing a large popping sound. At the sound of the pop, the hare took off like a bolt of lightning. He was going so fast that anyone hardly even saw him, other than a large trail of dust he left behind. The tortoise, on the other hand, put one foot in front of the other and began to make his way down the racing trail. As the hare continued to run as fast as he could, he decided to stop and look back at how far he had gone. He made it so far ahead that he could not even see the starting line, let alone any sign of the tortoise. He looked up at the sun and said to himself,
You know, it is such a beautiful day. I bet I can take a quick nap in the sun and be up and finish the race before the tortoise even gets halfway to where I am now.
The hare made up his mind and found a nice soft patch of grass in the sun to nap in. He laid down, smiled into the warm sun, and just like everything else the hare did, fell fast asleep. As morning turned to afternoon and afternoon turned to evening, the tortoise kept his pace along the path, determined to finish the race no matter if he were to win or lose. Eventually, as the last rays of the evening sun lit up the sky, the tortoise came upon the finish line. The woodland creatures cheered and hollered as they saw the tortoise come up over the hill, and the tortoise kept walking until he was only feet away from finishing. Meanwhile, back along the racing trail, the hare woke and bolted upright. He had slept all day long, and the sun had already set behind the mountains. He hopped to his feet and ran faster than he had ever ran before. He quickly came upon the end, just in time to see the tortoise slowly cross the finish line. All of the woodland creatures cheered for the tortoise, and they ran and gathered around him. The wise owl swooped into the group as well, shook the tortoise's hand, and said,
"Today was not about who was fastest. Speed is important, but persistence and determination will win every time. Slow and steady will win the race."
The end. We hope you have enjoyed The Tortoise and the Hare, brought to you by Sleepy Winks. Adapted and written for you by Zach Connor. Performed by Zach and Heather Connor.